On the island of St. Patrick, a forgotten piece of land in the harsh Atlantic, disturbing legends had been told for centuries. The local inhabitants, a handful of resilient men and women who remained despite the island's remoteness and the raw power of nature, preserved these old stories like myths. One of these tales centered around the mysterious lighthouse on a rocky promontory of the island. It was a stone structure, unyielding against the waves and storms, serving as a beacon for ships seeking safe harbor. But what made the lighthouse unique wasn't just its isolated location or ancient appearance, it was its two lights. One light shone from the top, guiding ships at night. The other, strange and eerie, glowed from the depths beneath the sea's surface. No one knew what the underwater light meant, but everyone on the island feared it. It was said that the light only appeared when disaster was looming. It was also said that those who lingered too long near the lighthouse would never return the same. Journalist Laura Connolly, known for her bold pursuit of hidden truths, decided to investigate this mystery. After years of chasing fringe stories and forgotten legends, the enigma of the island and its lighthouse irresistibly drew her in. When she arrived on the island, the locals warned her, some whispering, others speaking more loudly, that if she set foot in the lighthouse, her life would never be the same again. Yet, despite all the fear, Laura couldn't resist the call of the unknown. Laura stepped off the boat onto the small, lonely pier, surrounded by the cold, salty sea. The silence of the harbor was only broken by the sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore. As she looked around, she spotted a man watching her from a distance. His hair was streaked with gray, blowing in the wind around his tired face, and his piercing blue eyes immediately caught her attention. There was something unsettling in his gaze, not just its intensity, but something ancient, as if entire lifetimes lived outside the world of ordinary mortals lay behind it. When Laura reached him, the man smiled. It wasn't a completely friendly smile, more the smile of someone who knew more than they were willing to say. "Welcome to the island, Miss Connolly," he spoke in a voice that was both calming and disquieting. "I hope you're ready for what lies ahead." Laura studied him carefully. Despite his graying hair, his skin was surprisingly smooth. He looked younger than his gray hair suggested, yet there was a sense about him that he had lived through things that aged him beyond his appearance. His blue eyes held a strange depth, as though they concealed centuries of experience and secrets that would never be fully revealed. "You must be Patrick Murphy," Laura said, raising an eyebrow and trying to sound friendly. "Yes, the lighthouse keeper," Patrick confirmed with a nod. "I've been here for some time." "And you're the first to dare come here in a very long while." Laura noticed his limp. Patrick favored his left leg, each step seeming to cause him pain. When she asked him about it, he simply waved a hand, his slight smile never fading. "Old war injuries, nothing serious," he replied calmly, as if it were of no consequence. Laura stared at him intently. "War injuries? What war are you talking about? You seem too young to have lived through any major war." Patrick hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Time is peculiar on this island." His answer was vague, but Laura understood that she wouldn't get more out of him. Patrick turned toward the cliffs, his figure seeming taller and more menacing in the dim afternoon light. Laura felt a growing unease with each step, but she was determined to press on, eager to learn more about him, the lighthouse, and the strange legends surrounding the island. Patrick headed toward the cliffs, and Laura followed, her head full of questions. On the horizon stood the lighthouse, appearing as though it had been carved directly from the island's stone, defying both time and the elements. Above it, a white light towered, tirelessly flashing toward the open sea. And beneath the surface, when Laura glanced into the churning sea, she caught a brief flash of something green. As Patrick led Laura through the interior of the old lighthouse, his steps were slow and steady. It was her first real glimpse into the place that was now her temporary home. Laura was fascinated by the building's age, where the dampness of the sea mixed with the dusty air and the scent of old wood. As they walked through the narrow corridors, Patrick spoke about the lighthouse's history, how it was built in 1823 and had served as a protective point for ships entering the harbor. But his voice, though deep and quiet, seemed to hide something unsaid. Laura stopped in front of a large, ancient portrait hanging on one of the walls. It immediately caught her eye. It depicted a young man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, nearly identical to Patrick's. The portrait seemed to have been painted many years ago, but the man in it looked alive, almost as though he were gazing directly at Laura. Below the portrait was an inscription, Seamus O'Brien, First Keeper, 1823. Seamus O'Brien, Laura read aloud, turning to Patrick. He looks a lot like you. The resemblance is uncanny. Patrick froze for a moment, then quickly relaxed, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. Family resemblance, nothing more, he said, and swiftly moved on to another portrait on the opposite wall. Laura noticed that Patrick suddenly quickened his pace, as if wanting to close the subject as quickly as possible. But something didn't add up. The similarity wasn't just a coincidence, it was disturbingly precise. Too vivid. The young Seamus O'Brien looked almost identical to Patrick, as if he could be his double. Family resemblance didn't explain how a man from 1823 could look so much like someone living 2 centuries later. Laura sensed Patrick's discomfort and decided not to press further for now. But her curiosity only grew. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, hearing every small sound the old lighthouse made, the creaking of wooden boards underfoot, the wind whistling around the walls, and the distant roar of the sea. Just as she was on the verge of sleep, something pulled her back to wakefulness. Quiet footsteps. Someone was walking the corridors above her. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed above the ceiling of her room, approaching her door. Laura got up, quietly opened the door, and peeked out. In the dark hallway, she saw Patrick's figure standing by the window, looking out at the sea. Yet no one was with him, though his mouth was silently whispering words. Laura crouched behind the door, so Patrick wouldn't see her. She strained her ears to hear what he was saying. His voice sounded different, older, as if it came from another time. He had a strange accent that Laura had never heard before. She caught only fragments of his words, but they were chillingly clear. Soon, the light must be maintained. Patrick suddenly turned, and Laura quickly retreated back into her room. She heard his footsteps moving away down the corridor. For a moment, she thought he might try to confront her, but nothing happened. The air in the room felt heavy and charged with a strange energy. Laura stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. The next morning, as if nothing had happened, Patrick behaved the same as before, calm and courteous, with a slight smile on his lips. But Laura knew he was hiding something. Cautiously, she asked if he had seen anyone or heard footsteps in the night. Patrick looked at her with an innocent expression and shook his head. I didn't hear anything unusual. Maybe it was just the storm. Laura watched him closely, but Patrick's face remained impassive. Perhaps it had been the storm, but what about the strange accent she had heard in his voice? And what had he meant by the light? Laura knew she had to be careful. Patrick was concealing more than he was willing to admit. Later that day, after Patrick had left, Laura decided to take another look at the portrait of Seamus O'Brien. She stood before it, contemplating its meaning. Was it really just a family resemblance, or was there something more? She still had the image of Patrick's blue eyes, uncannily identical to those in the painting, burned into her mind. As she stood in front of the painting, it seemed as though Seamus's gaze grew more intense, as if he wanted to say something. Laura took a deep breath and ran her hand over the frame. When her fingers brushed a small seam, she realized there was something hidden inside the frame. She pulled back the fabric on the back of the frame and discovered an old, yellowed paper. Unfolding it, she found it was a diary entry written in old-fashioned handwriting. The light must be maintained, Laura read aloud, just like the words she had overheard Patrick whisper the night before. The entry continued, describing a cycle of keepers, who served not only the island but also what lives beneath the surface. Laura paused when she reached the final sentence. Each keeper is called to the waters when the time comes. With this discovery, Laura felt more unsettled than ever. Who was Patrick really? And what was actually happening on the island? With each passing day, the mystery seemed to deepen. Yet she felt drawn further, toward the light that had to be maintained. Laura awoke in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, her body covered in cold sweat. That strange dream had come again. She stood on the shore of the island, the wind whipping through her hair as she stared at the sea. Patrick's Island continued to reveal its mysteries to Laura Connolly. Every day, she felt more entangled in the strange pull of the lighthouse and the deep, green light beneath the waves. One night, a storm unlike any other swept across the island, and Laura knew this was the moment Finn had spoken of. The wind howled violently around the old lighthouse, its walls creaking and groaning as the sea crashed against the rocky shore. The power flickered, and for a moment, the lighthouse's guiding beam dimmed, leaving only the eerie green light from below illuminating the surrounding waters. Laura stood at the top of the lighthouse, peering out into the tempest. Her heart raced as she saw the green light pulsing in rhythm with the waves. She felt a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos, as if the light was calling her, inviting her to uncover its secrets. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy and slow, echoing off the stone walls. Laura turned to see Patrick, drenched from the storm but wearing that same knowing smile. His blue eyes shimmered with a strange intensity, reflecting the light from below. "It's time, isn't it?" Laura asked, her voice barely audible above the roaring wind. Patrick nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "The cycle is nearing its end, Laura. And the light must be preserved." "Preserved for what?" she demanded, stepping toward him. "What does it mean? What are you?" Patrick's gaze softened, as if he were suddenly burdened with a great sadness. "We are the keepers of this place, bound to it, tied to the light. Each generation of guardians, like Seamus before me, must ensure that the island and its secrets remain protected. But why me? What do I have to do with any of this?" Laura's frustration boiled over, her mind reeling with all the half-answers and cryptic warnings she'd received since arriving. "Because you were called," Patrick said simply, his eyes locking onto hers with a gravity that made her breath catch. "The island has chosen you, just as it chose Seamus, and just as it chose me." Laura's heart pounded in her chest. She felt the weight of those words settling over her, as if an invisible hand had suddenly laid a mantle of responsibility on her shoulders. "You can leave now," Patrick continued, stepping closer. "But if you stay, you will never be the same. The island will change you. The light will change you." For a moment, Laura considered fleeing, running from the lighthouse, from Patrick, from the mysteries of the island. But deep down, she knew that was impossible. Something inside her had already shifted, and there was no going back. "I'm staying," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Patrick's face remained calm, though his eyes held a flicker of something Laura couldn't quite place: relief, perhaps, or maybe even regret. "Then come," he said, turning toward the stairs that led down to the bottom of the lighthouse. Laura followed him, her footsteps matching his as they descended into the depths of the tower. The air grew colder as they went lower, and she felt the weight of the stone walls closing in around her. At the base of the lighthouse, Patrick led her to a rusted iron door she hadn't noticed before. He pulled a set of ancient keys from his coat pocket, unlocking the door with a creak that echoed through the chamber. Beyond the door was a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward, beneath the lighthouse, beneath the island itself. The air was damp and thick with the scent of saltwater. "Where does this lead?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To the source," Patrick replied. They descended in silence, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the heavy atmosphere. As they went deeper, Laura felt the pulse of the green light intensify, its glow reflecting off the stone walls in eerie patterns. At the bottom of the staircase, they emerged into a cavern, vast and ancient, the likes of which Laura had never seen. The walls were slick with moisture, and in the center of the cavern, a pool of dark water shimmered with the same green light she had seen from the lighthouse. "This is where it begins," Patrick said quietly. "And where it ends." Laura stepped closer to the edge of the pool, her reflection wavering on its surface. The green light flickered below, beckoning her closer. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It's alive," Patrick said, standing beside her. "It's older than the island, older than the sea. It's part of something much greater, a force that watches over this place, that ensures the balance between the land and the water. The lighthouse, the light above, is just one part of the story. But this..." He gestured to the glowing water. "This is the true heart of the island." Laura stared into the depths, mesmerized. The green light seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, and for a moment, she felt as though it was speaking to her, reaching out to her in a language she couldn't understand but instinctively knew. "Will it take me?" she asked, turning to Patrick. "It will take part of you," he said softly. "Just as it did with Seamus. Just as it did with me." "And what happens after?" Patrick smiled, but it was a sad smile, filled with the weight of centuries. "You become one with the island. You guard its secrets. You live, but not as you were before. The island chooses its keepers carefully." Laura felt the pull of the water, the light calling to her, filling her mind with strange visions of the ocean, of time stretching far beyond her comprehension. She could feel the ancient force beneath the island waiting for her decision. With one final glance at Patrick, Laura took a deep breath and stepped into the pool. The water was cold as it wrapped around her, and the green light enveloped her completely. As she sank beneath the surface, she felt the island's secrets pouring into her, stories of the past, of the keepers who had come before, of the forces that bound the island to the sea. And as the light consumed her, Laura knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same again.